Online. Thank you again. We have another series of distinguished speakers today for the second half. We are also going to have open forum that our good friend Jeff Jarvis will moderate after about an hour of discussion from the panel. I just wanted to make a note that Mika hasn't mentioned earlier. For those of you who are wondering exactly what the balance is on this panel, this is a flash conference, a term that Dave Weiner actually used. We did our best to reach out equally to people that we know in our community who we believe have different points of view on this topic. Because of scheduling and other issues, it's not possible always to get everybody. But we try as hard as we can at Personal Democracy Forum to create as much balance around political points of view. So although we may be leaning one way or in particular, we're hopeful that from the audience and from the panelists, we will get a completely balanced perspective. So without further ado, our first panelist is going to be Tom Watson, the author of Cause Wired, Plugging In, Getting Involved in Changing the World. Tom, take it away.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everybody for coming out today. This is just a fabulous crowd. I love the idea of a flash conference. I've seen a lot of flash causes come about over the past couple of years, but a flash conference is really something new. I was not here for the entire morning session, so I hope that what I have to say is not entirely repetitive. There were some terrific speakers there, and I did hear the Q&A, and there were some even better speakers from the audience. I have three basic points that I want to make in the few minutes allotted to me here, and this past week I wrote a kind of angry blog post in reaction to a post that Mika put up on Tech President. And as I was reading it again this morning, I thought, man, was I pissed off? And I'm not anymore. I'm hopefully a little bit more considered. But there are three basic points I'd like to make. One is that I think we should all bring a higher degree of skepticism to this entire story. That if we're talking about the future of journalists, and if many of us in fact are journalists, under whatever wide term we might want to define that as, the first rule is to be skeptical. And despite what others have said about WikiLeaks, I do believe that, and this may be somewhat controversial, I do believe that intent matters. I think that everybody has a point of view. I think that Julian Assange has a point of view. I think that the WikiLeaks organization has a point of view. And I think they have, in some ways, over the past few months, shown a political intent and a political aim and have made some political choices. I blogged that I thought that this WikiLeaks release and how it's been sort of timed and staged and planned may have been aimed at weakening the current U.S. administration. And I believe that's true. I may be wrong, but that was my take on it. And in the area of skepticism, I certainly wonder, at least aloud, and at least in the social commons with other people of intelligence and goodwill, about the power concentrated in that one man of mystery and his own self-assumed moral authority. I don't know. I don't yet have a judgment of good or bad long term, but I do think it is totally worthwhile for us to ask that question and to ask it a lot, because WikiLeaks has, in fact, quite a bit of power right now. And that goes to my second point, which is the question of accountability. We didn't necessarily plan for WikiLeaks. We didn't necessarily endorse its model, and we certainly didn't vote for it. And yet it has assumed a tremendous amount of currency and power on the public commons. And, you know, you can be in favor of increased transparency in government, as I certainly am, and yet wonder whether transparency is the only liberal value worth backing. Certainly, accountability and engagement are very, very important values. And you know, it may not be popular to ask this, but where do we plug in? You know, what are the results? How do we help to guide the future of WikiLeaks or the organizations like it that will undoubtedly spring up? which I believe to be a very positive trend. On the side of engagement and accountability, I work with a lot of not-for-profits, and I work with non-governmental organizations who work overseas in areas of conflict and in areas that are just in post-conflict. And some of the people who I have met and engaged and interviewed and talked to over the past couple of years are some of the bravest people I have ever met. Truly heroes. The women who run the NGOs that are partnering in some cases with the State Department in Afghanistan are doing phenomenal work. It's incredibly risky, and in some ways this may hang them out to dry. And there is definite nervousness in the NGO development overseas aid community about what may or may not be in the rest of those cables, of which there are, 248,000 still to be released? So Mika quoted Secretary of State Clinton's speech last year about the open internet and how this was going to be part of U.S. policy going forward, and I thought that was a good speech. I thought she should have said that, and yes, there is some irony in how the U.S. government reacted to Wikileaks over the past couple of weeks, and let's hope that that doesn't involve espionage charges and sort of ongoing name-calling back and forth. I think the U.S. government should lick its wounds, change, and move on. But I did focus in on one phrase from Secretary of Clinton's speech last year, the fact that we are one global community, and that engagement is really what matters in U.S. foreign policy, and that this administration, whatever faults it has, and it is an American administration running a gigantic bureaucracy with the largest intelligence operation on earth, it is still, I believe, more engaged than the previous administration was. Finally, and I only have a minute left, this idea of change. We have a tendency when something like this happens to say, this is the moment it all changes. This is the new now. We are the ones we've all been waiting for, et cetera. And if I've heard, I've been working on the internet for the last 15 years, if I've heard that once, I've heard it 8,000 times, I think we should take a much more considered view about what's really changing and actually dig in to the avenues of power, to the structures, to what the State Department is going to do going forward. Are they going to use this cable system anymore? I don't think so. In fact, I've read that they're starting to explore encrypted wiki as the way for communication internationally, and I find it ironic that WikiLeaks is no longer a wiki, so we don't necessarily have that sort of engagement that we once had. So I'm going to end where I started, in very, very mushy gray territory. Let's consider this a long-range, open-ended question, but let's not be afraid to ask about the political aims, the motivation, where we think actors on the international scene are trying to push us. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. I just want to ask the speakers quickly to just put your mouth as close to the microphone as possible so we can get the amplification for the whole room up. We heard you, Tom, but just reminding everybody. Emily Bell is next, the director of the Toast Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. Emily, take it away.
Thanks very much indeed. I've recently hopped the fence from being a practitioner in journalism. I was working at The Guardian as their head of digital until about 5 months ago. I've got a great memory for facts, which should be very reassuring to my students. And I want to thank WikiLeaks, obviously, for providing me with course material for the next 4 years in terms of what the future of journalism is and how we should think about digital journalism. Rebecca said in the first session, Rebecca McKinnon, for those of you who missed it, said that technical innovations outstrip government innovation, and government has to get better. It's also outstripped the press, and we've suspected this for some time. In fact, we've suspected it for about the last 30 years. But it's been a very helpful illustration of not, if you like, whether we should debate is the least useful debates in this, I think, is Julian Assange a journalist, and is this journalism? This is how information is going to be disclosed in the future, and if you're part of the ecosystem of disclosing and reporting information, which is journalism, then it's a fact. It sort of happens. It's not up for debate. And I think it's also reminded us of something else which is really, really important. And I'm sorry, this is a very narrow perspective because I'm really here just to talk about journalism, and I think everybody else speaks rather better about other aspects of this, which is we've been involved in an intense existential debate in journalism for the past 5 years, which is about profitability. And in fact, I've always felt that this was wrong, that the core purpose of journalism is not to make money, it is to effectively hold power to account. And what the last few months actually have shown us is that that core purpose and how we can do that accountably and responsibly, if it lays with the press, is really not about how to be most commercially successful, because organisations which do not have a profit motive or which do need other forms of funding other than advertising are now doing a better job of disclosing information in a particular arena than much of the press. So what do we do about this? Obviously, I think that education generally has a role to play. This can't all be left on the shoulders of the frail and rather unimaginative press. But we do have to think about what the process is for the press of the 21st century, and I think that we have to think about, we've had a really sort of speedy tutorial about what a source might be in the 21st century. How do we protect that? How is disclosure likely to happen? And also, if you are an existing institution, I'm actually quite pleased the press hadn't sort of crumbled into the sand in the last 3 weeks, because I think we've seen the real power of organisations that have political capital to actually amplify these stories in a way that would have been very, very difficult if you hadn't had presences like The Guardian and El País and Le Monde and the New York Times behind them. But at the same time, I think Jay's point in the earlier session is a good one, which is that, you know, part of the reason for all of this is that the watchdog function, I don't think it's dead. I think it's wrong to say it's dead in many parts of the world where actually journalists risk their lives on a daily basis. I think it's been anaesthetised in the US. This is my perspective as an outsider. And I think that this is something of a shot of adrenaline to its heart, and hopefully it will now wake up and grab the reins. So I think that if we can understand what the central purpose of journalism is, which is not to be part of the establishment, but is to ask difficult questions, hold power to account, and to relate what we find in clear and well-reported manner to the outside world. I also think the lesson of Wikileaks is how badly it was reported by a great deal of the mainstream press. Factual inaccuracies, sequencing errors, all sorts of muddled and unthought through reporting, which really didn't do us any favour as professional journalists at all. And as to has journalism changed, well, again, it's not a very useful debate because, of course, journalism is changing every day. It changes all the time. But just occasionally, I think it's been very hard for working journalists and working managers in news organisations to be able to conceptualise what change is, because often they're being thrown abstract concepts about technical things which they don't really understand. I think news organisations haven't really felt it necessary to have an opinion on the open web, or often they've taken the wrong decision. I think this really illustrates in very hard terms why it's important as a news organisation to understand what having net neutrality, an open web, whether it's illusory, as Douglas Rushkoff, I thought, rather brilliantly framed it in the earlier session, or not. These are really important things for the established fourth estate to understand. You have to understand the technology and how this is changing and what it means for your means of distribution. And I think that hopefully when you see the way that this story was reported simultaneously, internationally, by a number of organisations in cooperation, I can tell you as a senior editor that would not have happened 5 years ago. When you think that this was in collaboration with an organisation which is volunteer, it was done in a non-competitive fashion, this also would not have happened 5 years ago. The way it was tweeted, distributed, contextualised, and actually often commented on in a rather more clear and lucid fashion by people who were non-professional journalists also would not have been possible 10 years ago. So I think there's a lot to be very optimistic about, but I also think that in terms of the process, in terms of the policy, and in terms of understanding that it's important not to have a debate about what is and isn't journalism, but rather the debate about what is the fourth estate in the 21st century is something that we need to get past and actually start teaching people the skills to relate that to the outside world.
Thank you. Next up is Dave Weiner, the editor of Scripting News and a visiting scholar at New York University.
Thank you. I think all the talks here today have been absolutely fantastic. And it highlights what a perfect storm this event with WikiLeaks is, because it gives new rise to every issue that we deal with on the internet. Do I need to be a little bit closer again? And it's very hard to know which string to pick it up by. And so I'm going to pick it up by, and I could continue and elaborate on almost any one of the topics that people have raised. They're all excellent. And the one that I'm going to look at it from is from the standpoint of how safe our content is on the internet, and why this might be a very good time for us to start thinking about how we actually publish, and how vulnerable what we publish is. So if you think about, for example, my website, scripting.com, is hosted on EC2, which is a service that Amazon runs. And so what I learned in the last week is that if Amazon feels that what I'm doing is illegal, they'll turn me off. And now at first this put me into sort of I think a difficult situation. I don't know, Ariana, how you would feel if Huffington Post was hosted. For all I know, it is hosted on EC2. It's not, okay. So I wrote a piece about this, and I said I'm not going to be boycotting Amazon. There was a sort of a presumption out there in the internet that we were all going to start a boycott of Amazon. This is something that I can't do very casually, because if I were to decide to boycott Amazon, my blog would go off the air. So would every project that I've started in the last 15 years. And so it's not something that I can contemplate. But a friend of mine, Matt Terenzio, who works at a small newspaper in Connecticut, made a very important point, I thought. He said that this means that Amazon can't be used for journalism. And he's absolutely right. It can't be used for journalism. And he's also, and that by extension means that Amazon can't be used for blogging. And as much as I love Amazon and respect them, and it's kind of ironic because one of the projects that I've been working on is something that I call Future Safe Archives. And the idea is, I want my content to survive, for as long as it possibly can. I'm hosting the content of 2 relatives who've passed on. I want, when I die, that their content should be preserved as well. There's no strategy that works for that now. There's no approach that I can recommend as a technologist that says, here's a good way that's likely to survive for the indefinite future. We had this problem when I was a research fellow at Berkman Center. I was archiving the RSS 2.0 spec, and it went offline about a year after we posted it. And that's when I learned that none of this stuff, and it wasn't because the US government decided they wanted to get rid of it. It was just because it's hard to keep. This is why when Douglas said whatever you create is a permanent record, it's true, he's right, but it's also true that it's not a permanent record. That the half-life of this stuff is very, very short, and things tend towards disappearing on the internet. If you go back and look at my blog, 10 years ago, you'll find that most of the links that I point out to are dead links. It's been a remarkable struggle just to keep this stuff alive, my own stuff, to keep it on the air for this amount of time. And it only gets worse every year. I add more to the mess, and I'm carrying with me all the legacy that I've created. So the question is, what organizations are in the best position to help us keep this stuff around? And the WikiLeaks thing raises this issue in a really eloquent way, because they're creating stuff that we want to keep around. How long do we want to keep it around? I think we should keep it around for the indefinite future. That's sort of the way I think of it. It should be here. We should have it as a reference. The organizations I was thinking of were universities. Why? Because universities are long-lived. Universities, what organizations do we have that are long-lived? Insurance companies. You laugh, but how different is Facebook and Twitter from an insurance company. You think they're different, but they're not different. They're corporations. They behave like corporations. They do all the things the corporations do. They have this warm, cuddly, cute, icon of the little tweeting bird and stuff. That's great, but they still behave like a corporation. Mark Zuckerberg is peppy and interesting and cute too, but he's still a corporation. So I'm getting, all right, sorry. Well, he is peppy. So I thought, okay, universities and Amazon. I said, God, Amazon's really good at this. Google's really good. And then all of a sudden, now we can't trust Amazon. They really screwed the pooch on that one. So who else could we look to? And then I thought, well, listening to Emily's talk, this is why this has been such a productive conference, even though it's been very short. Why isn't this something the press does? Why don't they provide a repository, a trustworthy repository that stands up to whatever defenses we can provide as citizens? That we can't look to Amazon to be our bastion of safety here. Who could we look to? And that's the question. That's certainly not by any means the only question that this is raising. But it's an important one. And why shouldn't the press be in a place, the business of journalism be in a place to protect acts of journalism by everybody? And that's sort of the question I'd like to leave you with. So thanks.
So breaking news or breaking leak, we are now the 4th most trending topic on Twitter. Next up, to take advantage of that fact, is Zeynep Tufekci from the Sociology and Anthropology Department at the University of Maryland, who also blogs at technopsychology.com. I'm sorry, sociology, forgive me.
Right, it is technosociology, and yeah, my name is Zeynep Tufekci, and it is of Turkish origin, as I am, and we're going to have a wiki vote at the end of the panel whether my or Ariana's accent is cuter, so be prepared to take notes on that. Now, I want to start by making a few basic points that have been made from the audience, that these cables had been available to 3 million people. So what we are seeing is more a collapse of the insider-outsider distinction than necessarily really, top secrets being exposed, because anything available to 3 million people by definition is probably available to a lot of state actors that were interested in this topic and others. So this is more about the exposure of the day-to-day reality of statecraft and the civic face it has. So that's my first point. Now the second question that I want to address is the debate we're having and the fight that's going on, the tension, is not necessarily one of infrastructure, although that is important and I'll discuss that. It is one of legitimacy. It is one of legitimacy of the enterprise to start the move towards using these new tools to expose inner workings of power and where that is going to be seen as. So it's not just a question of, there's a lot of discussion about, well, we have now 1,000 mirrors and it's on BitTorrent and it's here and there. That may well be true, but the point is, as a Greek philosopher might have asked, if a tree falls in a forest and the MP3 is loaded onto a BitTorrent, does anybody really hear it? These kinds of information have to be put into the public sphere in a particular way, within context, with explanation, with understanding, with discussion, and with debate, for it to have a consequence. Otherwise, the fact that the information will somehow be there for the people who are motivated enough to get it will not really have the kind of political effect that people talk about. So while it's kind of a charade that Lieberman and others have engaged in to delegitimize Wikileaks by getting it off Amazon and PayPal and all of that, because we know they cannot get it off the internet, it is of profound consequence, because what they're doing is placing these kinds of activities as illegitimate, unacceptable, treasonous, criminal. And it's not just that you and I might think something else, but if these are tainted in this particular manner, they will not be the political equivalents of either the Pentagon Papers or other such exposures have been. So it's not that you can't donate to WikiLeaks if you really are motivated, it's just that it's being pushed off the public sphere. And I think that's important. It's not just infrastructure. Now, having said that, I do want to say that infrastructure really does matter, because two of the sort of most important social organizations, the states and corporations, have kind of moved off to what you might want to call extraterritorial, which is a term that comes from colonialism, in which an actor was not necessarily responsible and could not be held responsible in the jurisdiction that it was physically present in. We have governments telling us, well, we can't do anything about the economy because the bond markets, are unelected lords. Or we can't, in Europe they're telling the people that they will bail out banks but not, cut social spending. And it's all done in this area where citizens are kind of like colonial subjects. Citizenship has been greatly eroded. And it's partly because these actors are acting on a global scale to constrict us in the national one, right? They either threaten to move elsewhere, or they do move elsewhere where they're freer to do what they want. This is true for corporations and international wars. And the only way I can see to combat this kind of disempowering, this colonialism that we're all living through, is to organize in a scale that matches the scale that they're acting in. And internet is crucial to any kind of sort of response the global citizenry could mount in response to the fact that we've lost jurisdiction over our corporations and over our states to a degree. And that's why it really matters. So I want to make my first appeal on this to the tech community. And I don't want to get into the DDoS is legitimate or not. The question I have is what is effective? And I don't really see, you register your protest and that's okay, but it's not necessarily the most effective way to go forward in this, but it is to build an alternative infrastructure that does not suffer from the corporatization that our commons on the internet, everybody talked about, has suffered. I mean, there was a debate early on, privatization of DNS system, all of that won't really matter that much because of, corporations, they're just in it for the money. And we states might censor. The latest developments have shown that argument to be hollow. We need an alternative, collaborative, open infrastructure that is not subject to these restrictions. So my first appeal is to the tech community. There's a really productive way in which you can help us. Now my second point is, because legitimacy is the key here, this will not move forward in a productive manner unless large numbers of people get involved in this discussion and debate. It is not just about information. Information by itself is not a meaningful change actor. People are, citizens are. So we have to try to figure out what are the mechanisms by which this information or other kinds of information like this turns into political action through citizen involvement or reassertion of citizenship, which we've kind of been stripped of through the last 10, 20 years. So this is going to bring me to my final point, that the media, journalists, have a key role to play in this. I am not for all transparency all the time. I think very few people are. There are legitimate secrets. There are things. There will be more leaks. There's no question there will be more leaks. And the only sane way to go forward in a world where there will be more leaks is if there are trusted intermediaries that can do what has been done for these cables, which is to vet, to contextualize, to understand, and perhaps hold back certain information for safety and sometimes, yes, for national security. These are not always illegitimate. So journalists have a key role to play in taking this forward from where it is. And they need to maybe do it outside the corporate structures. By journalists, I don't necessarily mean, the way things are, because we need trusted intermediaries to do this. And my final appeal to journalists is that there's been all this talk about the crisis of journalism, all this appeal about where to go, And this is where you can go. And I promise you, if you come out there with credible reporting and investigation, the world will embrace you, and the democracy you save might be your own. Thank you.
Next up is Charles Ferguson. He's the director of No End in Sight about the Iraqi War, and also currently playing around the country a movie about the banking industry and the collapse of the banking industry, or I should say the collapse of accountability of the banking industry, titled Inside Job. Charles Ferguson.
Thank you. I may or may not be the designated reactionary here today. I have very ambivalent feelings about Mr. Assange and what he has done. I think that some of the things that WikiLeaks has done have been of great social benefit and badly needed, and others I find perhaps more questionable and disturbing. But I think that there's no question that his behavior and the emergence of his organization and the emergence of people interested in supplying information to his organization represent a response to a very real and disturbing and serious problem. It's in some ways not a new problem. There have been conflicts over government secrecy and governments and corporations hiding important and disturbing information from the public for a very long time. It's not that there's anything new about that. There are, however, two aspects of this that I think are somewhat new and are somewhat disturbing. The first is, of course, the translation of all of these old fights into the modern digital domain, and everything that represents and doesn't represent, and all the ways in which legislation, social custom, private corporate behavior, governmental behavior, individual behavior have and have not modernized themselves, and have not translated old models into this new world. So the United States government, to take one example among many, the United States government is having trouble deciding whether it can prosecute Mr. Assange because the Espionage Act of 1917 has not been appropriately updated. Now, whether or not he should be prosecuted, and whether or not he should be prosecuted for espionage, the Espionage Act of 1917 should have been updated. And there are many things like that pertaining to the governance of the internet and the legal status of journalism and free speech and so forth. And one of the most interesting and important and disturbing aspects of all this, I think, is the way that the WikiLeaks episode has revealed the lack of modernization of law and custom and justice and regulation of these arenas. The other thing, though, is the change in the way information has been handled and journalism conducted over the last decade. As a result, I would say, principally of two phenomena. The first being the way the United States government, first in the Bush administration, and then very similarly and with great continuity, the Obama administration, has conducted themselves, the government has conducted itself with regard to the handling of journalism and classification and investigations and prosecutions with regard to journalism over the last decade, since 9/11 gave the Bush administration the excuse and or motivation to begin changing the way the United States handles these things. When discussing these things with people who don't know much about them, I often ask them whether they know about national security letters. This is a very expert audience, and I would imagine the answer will be different here. How many people here know what a national security letter is? So something like half. Okay. So for those who don't know, a national security letter is a form of administrative subpoena that has existed in American law since the late 1950s. Following the 9/11 attacks and the passage of the Patriot Act, the usage and legal control of national security letters was changed very dramatically. And now there are a large, unknown, classified number of people who can issue national security letters, which are an administrative subpoena requiring the recipient to divulge information to the government, and also making it a felony for the recipient to divulge to anyone, including his or her attorney, what the information is, or even that they have received a national security letter. So how many of these are issued every year? Is it 500? Is it 1,000? Does anybody know? How about 50,000? And, you know, that's disturbing. And equally disturbing is that the use of these things has not changed since Mr. Obama took office. So, and I've encountered, you know, these kinds of issues in the making of my films, and let me close with two of them. And again, by saying this, I'm not saying that I endorse everything that Mr. Assange or WikiLeaks have done. I don't. I'm very troubled by some parts of it and very ambivalent about a lot of it. But when making my first film, which is about the occupation of Iraq, I learned fairly quickly that in the invasion of Iraq, the Defense Department had 14 high-definition camera crews that took a total of 200 hours worth of footage. It has never been militarily classified. Only 18 minutes of it has ever been released. We tried to obtain the 200 hours of footage. First, they said no, then we hired lawyers. Then eventually, when we were almost finished with production and the issue was moot, which they knew, they said for the modest sum of $100,000, and after a delay of approximately 6 months, they would make the footage available to us. And then, of course, in the financial crisis, there have been 0 criminal prosecutions. There have been a handful of civil cases. The civil cases have been settled without requiring admissions of guilt. Even the limited subpoenas that have been issued have revealed extraordinarily unethical, probably illegal, and disturbing information. But there has been no serious effort to use subpoena power to investigate what these people have done. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which is scheduled to provide its report in another month or two, had a total budget of $6 million, in contrast to which the special prosecutor investigating Mr. Clinton had a budget of about 10 times that. It has a budget of $6 million. It had subpoena power. Subpoenas had to be approved by both parties, and the first subpoena was issued after they'd been working for 6 months. They've issued less than 24 subpoenas. So, unfortunately, there is a place for leaking in the modern world. Thank you.
Next up is Andrew Keene, author of the, I lost your, oh, here it is, author of the forthcoming book, Digital Vertigo, an Anti-Social Manifesto. Andrew.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to be here, and I'll try and, I don't really have anything original to say. I'll just try and join a few dots with what other people have said. I really like Mark Pesky's point at the beginning when he said, Pesci, sorry. The culture we've grown up with has suddenly shown its age. And I think that's the theme of this event. There's what Zainab called, I guess, a crisis of legitimacy. Dave Weiner called it a perfect storm. I think it's a broader problem. You said that you were someone said they were the designated reactionary. I think I can claim that more than anyone on this panel. Yeah, I'm a defender in some ways of the old age. My previous book, Cult to the Amateur, was sympathetic to the old regime. But the reality is, for better or worse, from my point of view, it's worse, but there's not much I can do about it, that old regime is dying. And I think this whole conversation is about the crisis both of power and trust in the old regime, which is resulting in this, I don't know what you call it, a spectacle. The French theorists have a good word, the spectacle of secrecy. The casualty of the old order, of the crisis of legitimacy of the industrial meritocratic order that friends like Jeff Jarvis and he's not a friend, but Jay Rosen applaud. Jeff is a friend, of course. Is the crisis of this meritocratic order, the crisis of the university system, of the big media, of government, of the foreign service, everything that's happening from the attacks on big media to the attacks onto the foreign service are all about this challenge to the traditional authority of top-down mass media industrial society. And it comes from both left and right. It's not, most people here I think probably are on the left, but when you look at what Sarah Palin and the Tea Party people are doing, it's identical. A challenge to everything that we've taken for granted. And it's no coincidence that the internet is both a casualty, a consequence, and a cause of this. The internet didn't create this. The internet came out of this as much as anything else. So what you have then is the challenge to that meritocracy. We don't trust our journalists anymore. We don't trust our foreign service people anymore. We don't trust our politicians. We don't trust our bankers. And many of the reasons why we don't trust them are right. But in the old regime, a regime that worked, one of legitimacy, we gave them the benefit of the doubt. Secrecy, for better or worse, again, is a reality. We have to live with it. But in structures of power that worked, we gave the elites the benefit of the doubt. Now we don't, and of course we have the technology that enables us to call them on it continually. So I think Mark Pesce was kind of quoting Clay Shirky when he said the old structures don't work, but the problem is that the new structures haven't come about yet. So when Clay very famously said, we've destroyed old journalism, but we don't know what the new journalism, more broadly, the old structures of power are being destroyed. They're going away. The old meritocracy, top-down, mass industrial age, which people like Jeff write about in such an interesting way, are going away. But what replaces them? And I think that there's two schools of thought, I think. There are the idealists like Rushkoff and Jeff who believe that this distributed structure of power can lead to more democracy, that we can do away with hierarchy once and for all. They are, of course, McKinnon talked about the Federalist Papers. They're the anti-Federalists. We've had this debate before. And maybe they're right, maybe they're not. I tend to be more of a realist and believe, a follower of, say, the sociology of someone like Pareto, and believe that there is always going to be power, like it or not. So the real question then becomes, in this new age where trust has broken down with the old elites, the real question is, what is this new world that's coming into being? Who are the new elites? Where will power lie? Now, I've written quite a lot about, on the internet, the new power lies in, I've had my differences with people like Dave Wine, and I think we agree that the new structures of power lie with companies like Google and Facebook. For better or worse, they are the vehicles for our opinions, but they're the ones who have acquired power. They're the ones who hold the trump cards. In terms of journalism, I think Jay Rosen makes an interesting point. The old structures of power don't work anymore. We don't trust the messenger. So where does power lie? And I think when it comes to journalism, the real power may indeed lie with the leaker. Leaking becomes the way in which to build trust and authority in this new media age. So Assange is more than just a symbolic figure. He's an example of the next generation of information mongers or sources of power. In political terms then, where does power lie? Will it lie with Sarah Palin? Will it lie with people who are continually questioning that power, who are implicitly or otherwise continually undermining the structures of the meritocracy? All of us here, I think, are representatives of that meritocracy. The right has figured it out. In my view, and I tend to be politically on the left, I think the challenge of the left in this new world is to directly confront this issue of the crisis of legitimacy and authority, and to figure out, in the context of social justice and openness and all the other things that we probably all here believe in, how to rebuild authority. Because the world doesn't work without trust. It doesn't work without secrecy. And if we don't discover an antidote to this crisis of legitimacy in the 21st century, then I think that people like Palin and the Tea Party will run amok. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Aria Huffington, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Andrew and Micha, for putting this together so fast. It's been absolutely fascinating. I was having breakfast with Andrew last Saturday, and he said, we're thinking of doing this, and here we are now. And also, it's been unbelievably erudite. I've been making notes on Spinoza. I've been making notes on various Greek philosophers quoted here, and learning a lot about how many national security letters have been issued. So thank you for all that. I really completely agree with what, let me just see who said that earlier. I think it was Katrin who said that we should stop conflating everything. I think one of the problems is that we are now conflating everything. We're conflating what we've learned, all the issues about the internet freedom, and is Julian Assange a saint, a visionary, or a jerk? And I would say that these are three different issues, and I would like to take them in order. The first is, what have we learned? You know, we're actually almost forgetting to discuss what of significance has come out of the leak so far. And yet, for me, as somebody who is obsessed with our policy in Afghanistan, this is incredibly important. You know, Richard Haas, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, dismissed it, saying the leaks simply confirm, they do not inform. But I would disagree. First of all, there is something about how social change and social understanding around big policies evolves that has to do with the drip, 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 drip release of information, not just the one spectacular deep throat Watergate moment. And we're seeing that with these leaks. We're seeing that all this additional information about just how unwinnable the war is, how, as our ambassador in Pakistan, Ann Patterson, is quoted as saying, it's basically undermining our national security, how you have the former vice president of Afghanistan arriving in Dubai with $52 million in basically American taxpayer money, which he's allowed to keep. You know, this is really the issue of kind of more mercury poisoning. You know, it happens little by little. It doesn't just happen all at once. And maybe it could be the information about the 52 million that actually makes the public say, enough is enough, let's get out of there. You don't know what it is. And in that sense, this is a very, very significant outcome of the leaks that I think has been missed in all the debate and controversy around, is this a good thing, is it a bad thing, what does it mean about the future? Related to that is the whole question that Andrew was talking about right now of trust. That is key. You know, Craig Newmark has said that trust is the new black. And there is no question that right now the breakdown of trust in all institutions, political, financial, media, is at the center of what we are all dealing with. And the fact that right now we do not trust in our financial institutions, for example. It's interesting that some of the new revelations in the future may be about Bank of America, because this has had huge consequences in the lives of millions of people. This is not a theoretical argument. The fact that our financial institutions have been allowed to do everything they did and are so unaccountable, and as you were saying, you know, there have been zero criminal prosecutions, the sense that the game is rigged, that if you're a member of the financial elite, you are bailed out, you are doing just fine, and if you're an ordinary working American, you may very likely be out of a job, or your home may have been foreclosed, partly because of the policies of the Bank of America, makes all that unbelievably significant. I mean, it has the kind of significance that great journalism has, if revelations can come out that will affect our public policies. So that also is connected with what Jay Rosen was talking about in terms of the watchdog press. And Jay and I have been, and Jeff and many of us have been talking about that for a long time, because we've seen what access journalism has done to our journalism. And we're seeing it again now. The fact that we had the invasion of Iraq and the financial meltdown with so few great journalism to do a kind of biopsy about these events rather than autopsy shows how incredibly significant these leaks are in that context. And, you know, as Simon Jenkins said in The Guardian, the first day that The Guardian wrote about the latest cables, it is not the job of the media to protect power from embarrassment. I'm sorry, it's not. And for me, you know, my favorite hero when I was growing up in all of literature was the little boy that shouted out that the emperor wears no clothes. That was always my greatest hero. So in that sense, Wikileaks are part of that incredible tradition that dates back to fairy tales. My second point is over this debate of secrecy versus transparency. I really love what was said in the earlier session about there is a difference between secrecy and privacy. That's a very legitimate difference. And there will always have to be things that are private, whether it's in our private lives or in our political lives. But the problem here is that, and here I'm quoting Andrew, that this is not the issue of government legitimately withholding information. This is the issue of government outright lying to us. When, for example, the same week that the latest cables came out, the president went to Afghanistan and told us that we're winning there. He was lying. Everybody knows he was lying. Why can't we just say so? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm upset. And related to that is the fact that the establishments always kind of wax lyrical about the internet, right? They love transparency, they love interactivity, they're in love with social media, provided people tell us where they're having their Pinkberry and whether they're doing, what latest Groupon deal they're doing, etc., provided it's all cozy and safe and doesn't rock the boat. We love it. It makes us so hip and cool to love social media and have a Twitter account. But right now, we see that there are real risks here for the establishment. And let me just, not that I'm run out of time, but just if I can have 50 more seconds. You know, Hillary Clinton, in her famous speech, praised the freedom of the internet. When the cables were released, she said that this is an attack on America's foreign policy interests, endangering innocent people. The president, I want to read you very quickly what he said recently about transparency. He said, transparency promotes accountability and provides information for citizens about what their government is doing. Information maintained by the federal government is a national asset. We have to use technology to open up our democracy. It's no coincidence that one of the most secretive administrations in our history, he was referring to his predecessor, has favored special interests and pursued policies that could not stand up to the sunlight. He said that theoretically, but when there was some sunlight on his own policies, his own State Department is doing everything it can to stop the very transparency that he celebrated. And just quick 10 seconds on Julian Assange, my third point. It doesn't really matter whether Julian Assange is a saint or a jerk. That's a totally incidental point. It's very interesting. Trust me, I'm sure there'll be great novels and movies and plays about it. For me, the most fascinating thing is what I've just learned about Swedish law and secret, whatever it's called, sex by secrecy or secret sex or something. But bottom line, it comes down to the fact that a broken condom is a criminal act. The guys, you better be warned, which gives a whole new concept to the idea of Wikileaks. Thank you.
Okay. Ariana, you just broke the record in the world for retweets.
I hope my WikiLeaks thing makes it.
Okay, so we're going to go back to open forum. Again, I'm going to ask everybody who wasn't here earlier that this is a civil forum. We'd like you to make first introduce yourself. We'd like to have you make your point concise as possible. The panelists are welcome to join into the conversation, and our Oprah Donahue stand-in, Jeff Jarvis, will moderate the session. Go to it, Jeff.
I want to quote Dave Weiner again, who said when he started unconferences that the people who should be here are here. So you're here. But I've also heard people complain about the diversity of this crowd. True. But I also would say we have, how many now? 2,000 some people out there. And I would suggest this is the first event of many events like this that should happen among many constituencies in many countries. And it's the beginning of discussion. I would also suggest for the remaining hour we have, we're not going to solve anything, but can we add to the catalog of the discussions we must have and keep going on? That's the beauty of today is we started discussions, many discussions, and let's keep that going. So I want to make one more point to Andrew since he quoted me. I think you're right, Andrew, and that pains me to say it. It catches in my throat. That we see the leaker as the powerful. But I would also say to you that I think that the only sane response to leaks is transparency. And so you can gain the power back by gaining openness and trust. End of my little spiel. Okay, you were first.
Hey, Jonathan Stray, Associated Press. As most of us know, WikiLeaks has gone through extraordinary technological measures to assure that the cables are available to the public, mirrored servers, torrents, etc. Without those measures, would the press have been able to write about the cables at all? Because our right to read them is ultimately not backstopped by any sort of international law about censorship. Such law does not exist yet.
And I also wonder, the question was raised before about backing up the data, as David said, why isn't Google a mirror to this? Why isn't the New York Times, and why isn't the Guardian a mirror to this data?
Hi, Victor Navasky. Any number of panelists on both panels have seemed to agree that government ought to relax about WikiLeaks and it ought to not protect secrets that are mere political embarrassments. But people also said at the same time that there are legitimate secrets, that there is dangerous information, that there are national security interests that have to be protected. What interests me is what is the role of a responsible news organization in terms of, if any, of protecting valid, legitimate, so-called legitimate secrets. It seems to me that you get into a problem if you think the role of a responsible press is to, in effect, protect the secrets of the United States of America in this country. In other countries, the same question would arise.
Victor, let me ask you in turn. So the question really becomes, who decides what's secret? Who should, in your view?
The press should decide what it should publish. The government can decide what it wants to keep secret, but once it's leaked, the question is, should the press be in the business of enforcing the government's decision about what's legitimate?
Someone back here was, yeah, I'll go with you first. I'll come back. Don't worry, I'll come back.
So hi, my name is Brian. There's a word that seems kind of lurking down underneath the conversation here, which is about sabotage as a way of describing asymmetrical power. So despite everything that the internet has changed, do we really believe the ethics of sabotage are different now than they were 20, 30 years ago? So, and if we don't have an ethical agreement over when sabotage is right and when it isn't, because we have differences in opinion, how do we go about dealing with this asymmetrical sharing of power? And how do we set a positive example rather than just react to what individual actors do?
Well, certainly one of the major topics out of today is that question of what is civil disobedience, what is the ethic of this, and we certainly are not answering it this morning, but we are raising it.
Hi, my name is Atul Kumar, and my question is very relevant to my home country, India, and within that a state which on economic parameters is almost like sub-Sahara, but it has a great past and all that, Buddha and all that. My question is, much of the audience here and the people who are talking about WikiLeaks and have been affected by it, you have online all the time, be it Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Much of my home country, not home country, my state, we don't have internet for 80% of the population, 90% of the population. How relevant Wiki is for them? What do we do for them? And second question is slightly different. Why is this whole WikiLeaks focused on America, US, UK, the developed world? No North Korea, China, and maybe even my home country, India. I don't see much discussion, so any comments on that?
Well, WikiLeaks is, by its structure, opportunistic as to who leaks, right? And is that the ones we most want leaking? That's another question.
Hi, my name is Mark Belinsky. I'm with Digital Democracy. I was just in Iraq working on open governance with No Neck, who was throwing his body on the rails. And I asked, you're risking your life for democracy. Why? To one of the guys, and he said, well, because of Monica Lewinsky. And I said, why for Monica Lewinsky? And he explained that, well, he understood democracy because nobody was above the law. And I'm worried that now we're teaching the lesson overseas and around the world that that is no longer true. And with the SHIELD Act, taking laws that are in place in Thailand where people can go to jail for 82 years, 100 years for owning a website, we're getting to a really dangerous place instead of just focusing on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what it means to have free speech and in the digital world.
Let me show the shows of hands for all who want to. I'll forget, I promise you, but I'll think. Okay, Susan, you were. Yeah, I remember you were further.
Thank you. I lived in the belly of the beast for 32 years at Time Incorporated, and I came to Washington not long after a guy named Simmons Fentress in the Washington Bureau traveled to Saigon, saw what was going on, came back to New York, and told Henry Luce to his face that Time Incorporated's coverage of the Vietnam War was a lie. I think that was a high point of sorts, and I think it's been downhill ever since. In terms of the definition ongoing of journalism, what I'm intrigued with is the notion of taking someone like an Anonymous and coupling it with the kind of guy who made Inside Job. It's a new model, and the threat, I don't believe, is so much from government sources as economic ones. That's the trick, is to figure out how to monetize it. Can it be done? I'm doing something that's going to do human interest stories on 3 billion people in the developing world who no one ever hears about. You can teach an old dog new tricks. I think we're at an incredible juncture that is seeing the pendulum swing toward what I'm afraid could become a tyranny of anarchism if we don't begin to exert some context for the data. I think it's possible, and I think the people in this room are the ones to do it. Thank you.
Charles, did you want to answer that?
Not quite certain that I understand the point that was being made, but I will say this: in making the film that I just made, I did not have a problem getting the film funded or distributed. I mean, everybody has problems, but the film got funded, and it got funded. Over half of the money came from a multinational corporation, Sony, which is distributing it and has distributed it with energy and good faith. The main problem I had is that people like Henry Paulson and Robert Rubin and Larry Summers won't speak to me, of course, and nobody has used subpoena power to figure out what they were doing. That's the main problem I had.
Over here, I'm gonna favor folks who haven't spoken yet, so just be aware.
I'm Daniel Latore, and I guess the question I have is, there's the, I guess as Clay framed it, the long haul and the short haul, and some of the stuff I've been hearing today seems to be very focused on the long haul, but I don't think we would be here today if, when almost 10 years ago, several million of people put their bodies in the line and protested out in the streets to prevent war, and the media system that exists today allowed all of that to be swept to the side. And so we do need to rebuild the media system, but I think we need to also start talking about how can we do this in the short haul. And that short haul, I don't think is that short. And it's still going to be quite a complicated battle that requires a lot of context. So I'd like to hear more people talking about what can we do now.
I'll dare quote Andrew Keene again, but part of the question I think we raised again today too is, are we seeing the death of a meritocracy or the rise of new meritocracies?
Hello, my name's Nick Merrill. I founded an internet service provider here in New York in 1994. I was the plaintiff that sued the FBI over the national security letters. Basically, thank you. This lawsuit that I was involved in lasted over 6 years. It's actually still kind of ongoing. I wanted to address the question of, can private internet service providers be trusted to protect privacy and anonymity? I don't think they can. And in that direction, I've actually founded a not-for-profit organization that's going to do internet service provider stuff. It's also going to do web hosting and some telephone stuff. And I'm looking to reach out to people who are also interested in these topics to get some support. I'm trying to raise money. I'm trying to find logistical support. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say, so thank you.
Can they not be trusted because of what they do or because the government won't allow them to be trusted? What's your point?
My point is, I don't think they can be trusted because their goal is to make money. It's not to protect people's rights. I think that only a not-for-profit organization whose only goal is to protect people's rights is what we should be looking towards. And in that manner, I think that I'd like to try to do more stuff in terms of constitutional challenges to some of the unconstitutional spying laws that are out there. I mean, that's the direction that I'm going in. So just kind of putting that out there. If anyone wants to talk to me about this, I would love to talk to anyone. Thank you.
So add capitalism to the catalog for today, which Emily raises in one way, you raise in another way. I teach entrepreneurial journalism, not an oxymoron, because I think we have to be sustainable. And part of the question is, how are we going to sustain much of what we talk about? That's another debate. Andrew?
I just wanted to add, I think that was a really good point, and I think McKinnon makes really good points. She wrote a really good piece in CNN Opinion, which was published this week. I think a lot of it comes down to business models. I think we've, again, fetishized, people like Chris Anderson fetishized the free model. We all love our free accounts on Google and Facebook and Twitter. But the reality is that all these companies now are building business models around advertising, which inevitably means them compromising our information, because that's their business model. So one of the things when it comes to this whole debate about whether information should be free, one of the consequences of this quote-unquote free information or free information services on the internet is by definition an economy that compromises our freedom, our privacy. I think we have to acknowledge that. And there are two choices as a consequence. Either we have the BBC public model, which I like, I'm from the UK, or we have a model where Facebook and Twitter charge users for their services. And then we'll have to guarantee the kind of terms of use privacy that most people want, but they won't get with free services.
Over here, Chris.
Yeah, hi, Chris Anderson, not the one Andrew just mentioned.
Are you a fetishist about anything else?
I have less money than him. Just had a question in general for the panel about the different international coverage of the leaks and the role that sort of the different international media having access to the cables has played in its coverage. Someone who regularly reads the New York Times, I think the New York Times coverage of the leaks in general have been as friendly to the State Department as coverage of deeply embarrassing things about the State Department can be. So I'm wondering if folks could talk about the way the European press and the other press have covered it compared to the Times.
Emily, you want to take that?
Yes. I mean, my Spanish is a bit rusty, so I'm not great at all of this, but I have looked at what the European press have been saying. I mean, you're right, naturally, when you think that the cables which the Wikileaks have put out are all ones that have been redacted by the press, but that not all by the same press organisation. So The Guardian has published more than, for instance, New York Times has. I think that I think El País has certainly published some which were of more interest to what they felt was their audience. And I agree with you that I think the role of the New York Times in this is, again, a great one for media studies students to debate. I mean, I would actually say that online, I think they've been a little bit more robust. They've done a great job in actually covering the story through the lead blog, which I think has been a terrific sort of elucidator of what's actually going on a day-to-day basis. But Bill Keller gave an interview to the BBC where actually the BBC interviewer was slightly incredulous, saying, you mean you actually asked the State Department what they wanted you to take out? But this is this is a symptom of what I say about, the US press has had it's really had 10 years where it's been bowed under the threat of national security. And it's not surprising that with that, plus the constant need for a business model, that its coverage has been much less robust. But, I was astonished by the Wall Street Journal this week, which must have in its audience people who are deeply interested in what's happening in diplomatic relations in all parts of the world. And it was very hard to find any coverage of the cables in the first half of the paper. It was very easy to find all sorts of slightly ill-informed opinion. Mort Zuckerman, for instance, writing on cybersecurity, which was, I'm sure, a lesson for everybody, in the back half of the paper. And this is what I mean about actually kind of where the interests of the press were exposed as being far too close to the establishment. And as I say, in Europe, not so much, but then again, it wasn't our establishment.
Yeah.
We shall see what the Wall Street Journal does when it comes to Bank of America leaks, eh?
Can I make a point about the global, and it kind of feeds into what we've been talking about, the crisis of legitimacy and how information by itself doesn't always mean what we might think. I've been following the Turkish press and a lot of the Turkish commentary in the social media, and there is a strong rumor that this is a U.S. setup, that they think these leaks are fake leaks, and a lot of people have been arguing that these must all be false. And this kind of highlights part of what Andrew was saying about the crisis of authority and legitimacy and what to believe, and people breaking up into sort of little epistemological communities where they only listen to each other, and it's harder and harder to know who to trust, what to do, and that ends up with great disempowerment of people, and that's a big question for the future.
Who here is from another country following the press in that country about WikiLeaks? Let me just go around for real quick. I know you. I want to hear just Twitter length. Give me a summary of what you're hearing.
Israel, WikiLeaks and the Jews.
That's just kind of a blanket about anything, guys.
That's the Twitter length.
Germany, WikiLeaks in America and American hegemony.
WikiLeaks and Australia, obviously particular interest because of Julian Assange. GetUp, which is an organisation which I'm on the board of, is like a citizens movement. It has 400,000 people. We've just run a campaign to the American government actually to say, listen, Assange should not be persecuted, should not be judged prior to being charged. It's actually been the most incredibly powerful campaign that GetUp has run in its 4 years. Raised $270,000 in 24 hours to put an ad in the New York Times, which will happen on Tuesday, which is the equivalent of like $6 or $8 million with one email. So just in terms of protection of
the Australian dollar in that better shape? No, sorry. Who else? Real quick. I just want to hear real quick summaries.
Russia, America is weak and hypocritical.
China is a crisis of the U.S. government. There's no mention of anything covered related to China. So
Anyone else? Real quick. Okay, hold on. If anybody else is back here, tell me now.
WikiLeaks in Japan. Japan and the U.S. have so many secret agreements that the foreign ministry everybody's getting ulcers, concerned about which cable is going to be released about which secret agreement tomorrow.
The WikiLeaks about the Somali pirates, they were right about the shipment to Kenya of arms was in The Guardian.
Anyone else? Real quick. Okay. One or two more, then I'll go back to you, sir.
WikiLeaks in Canada. A.
WikiLeaks in Canada.
Aren't you supposed to apologize now? Anyone else? All right, sir. I love Canadians. I do. Country.
France, WikiLeaks, and America getting a black eye.
Anyone else? Real quick.
I'm surprised. My name's Nick Burke. I'm surprised nobody's given a shout out to Bradley Manning. We would not be here if it wasn't for what Bradley Manning allegedly did.
a Lady Gaga CD and a magic marker and a lot of, well, some people might say bravery, some people might say stupidity. But he's allegedly the guy that took the data dump. And he apparently also dug around on servers. That video of the helicopter gunship, the black and white video, was not something that was part of diplomatic cables. He poked around on openly available servers in the military and found a folder with the video on it. He's in prison right now. I'm not necessarily a supporter of him, but as I said, I don't think we would be here having this event if it wasn't for what he had done. Nobody else ever stepped up and so boldly copied such an enormous amount of information. Mr. Ross over here has been shaking his head at the mention of 3 million people having access. So I'd like to hear from you quickly why have you been shaking your head? Is that inaccurate? Thanks.
It's entirely implausible to me that 3 million people had access to this kind of information. Secondly, it's implausible to me that Bradley Manning downloaded 250,000 cables, some dating back to 1966. And I think it's really important that everybody respects the principle of innocent until proven guilty. People are talking about him as if he's guilty, as if he did it, and we simply don't know that. And I'm rather skeptical that that could be the case.
Just on a lighter point, I heard a rumor the other day that don't ask, don't tell policy is actually directly responsible for WikiLeaks because Bradley Manning was using a Lady Gaga CD to copy all the documents, and people in his office were afraid of asking him about it for the fact of the don't ask, don't tell policy.
You're just jealous because Ariana had a punchline. But I think you're exactly right. So this raises the real question here is the protection of the whistleblower. We're concentrating on ourselves as intermediaries in this process. And it's not the intermediary, it's the source. And the source is what we have to ask about in great measure. Are you going to hit the same point?
So if you're not familiar with how the leaks actually came about, it's something called the SIPRNet, right? This is the Secure Internet Protocol. This is something that was opened up after 9/11 with trying to push towards need to share versus need to know. That was shut down at the State Department earlier this month, previous to when a cable gate really broke. And now the military estimates somewhere between 400,000 to 500,000 had access to SIPRNet. So that 3 million number is probably not quite accurate. And in terms of thinking through people who have secret clearances versus people who have access to that network, it's useful just to consider that and how actually, if you're going to be mad at someone, consider being mad at the people who didn't have accurate logging or security or other kinds of things on that network which allowed that leak to happen. It's very important to think through the people who are in the contracting community who may not have done their job as well to secure the national interest.
If I can briefly make a comment about Bradley Manning and his status. The United States government actually, and the FBI in particular, actually have an astonishingly bad record with regard to correctly investigating, competently investigating and accurately identifying people who have committed offenses in whether they should be prosecuted or not, the ethics of it aside, the United States government is not an unimpeachable source with regard to the identification and investigation of high technology crimes. Quite the contrary. So innocent until proven guilty is actually very important here.
Over here.
Something that's occurred to me as I've listened to this conversation is the sort of informational value of what's actually been released. To your points, Andrew, which I think were really well stated about the need for trust and authority, in the absence of those, I think it's hard to really put a lot of value in this information. We haven't talked at all about what happened in Pakistan with the false stories from the leaks. You know, I don't know in light of Stuxnet how we can think that it's impossible that a complex worm could not have infiltrated the cache when it was first released, and there was all sorts of false information. You know, in the scarcity of authenticity or trust when it comes to digital systems, I don't know what we do with this type of information.
Who next? I'm going to still go to people who haven't spoken first. Okay. Sorry. Isn't this better than standing up in a line, right? Right? Put me to work.
I sort of think it's important because we're dealing with a complex issue, to have a complex debate. And so far, the way we've been doing that is by opening questions about the future of organizations and organization. It's ironic because most of the people on the panel represent some kind of organization. That's how people make money now. In the future of this conversation, I wonder how it will happen and where it will happen. It's been centered around the Wikileaks hashtag. Maybe now it's centered around the PDFLeaks hashtag. I was struck by something that Andrew Keene said earlier about new structures. I just checked. There are two unregistered domain names, newstructures.net and newstructures.org, and there's obviously the hashtag. Let's continue this somewhere and start building a complex model of the debate around what happens next that just is appropriate to this discussion and lives up to its importance.
And I think you were making a different point in psychology before, right?
Brett Solomon from Access. We're a global movement for digital freedom. Just quickly, I think that one of the sort of responses that happens when there are crises like this is the role of the military. And I think we're going to see an increasing demand. We know that there's a debate that's happening at the moment in the US between Homeland Security and the Department of Defense about the militarization of the net and who actually, under whose purview it is. So my main concern is that we're now going to see, in the context of the so-called cyber war, an increasing debate and an increasing supremacy of the military on the internet and in the digital sphere. So just raising that red flag.
Going with the person before, I think when Mika and Andrew called this event, they said we're not going to come out with a manifesto today. They said we're not going to accomplish anything today because we're going to start the discussion. But I think if you were going to have a follow-up event, I'm curious.
We are. We're going to do this again right after the holiday.
Okay, good.
In fact, we were asking people earlier whether people think we should do it in New York or whether we should do it someplace else or Washington. I mean, obviously, we'd love to have this conversation go on all around the world, but maintaining a level of civility at all of them is going to be a little hard if we just completely open it up. So we'd be curious to hear everyone's comments.
Let's do it someplace new like New Jersey.
Or Canada.
Yes, Canada. What I was going to ask was, if you, again, tweet length, what do you think the next event should ask or try to accomplish? Right? Anybody? Anybody? Yes.
Pragmatic solidarity, which is Paul Farmer's notion of people working on the same issue but from very different perspectives coming together and finding out how they can collaborate in a very meaningful, actionable way.
That's supposed to be. That's called democracy.
Yeah. Well, around what particular piece of this many issues we've raised today?
I think what can an individual person do in their everyday life to contribute to the creation of some pro-social action in this space?
Simply, what should be the shape of the new politics that are emerging?
I'm still going with this flash question.
Use this as a case study for what kind of infrastructure needs to surround innovative moments. We talked about tech infrastructure, we talked about cultural infrastructure, talked about political infrastructure, bureaucratic infrastructure, and even our own.
So, as part of the Obama administration's open government initiative, I'm really interested to hear how the State Department can actually just be really frank and honest about addressing this issue. I think there are plenty of people in the State Department who have an interest in sort of breaking through the barriers that exist within the State Department to be able to just have more of an honest discussion about how to move forward from here. So I want to know how we can, as a community, encourage the State Department to not overreact and sort of draw themselves out of the conversation. And how we can really engage them to move this forward.
Right. So part of the question was that the feeling that we should have government here, and I know John Bracken asked that question on Twitter beforehand, and Mika answered and said, well, haven't we heard the government signed up? But can we have a dialogue with this topic on government? Dave first, then Rebecca.
I'm going to agree with what the gentleman in the back said about we need to bootstrap a system where we can respond to these kinds of things quickly in the future. So it's how do you have these kinds of discussions in a productive way? It's kind of meta, but it's how you solve these problems with technology, is you use the technology discover how you're going to solve the problem with more technology.
What if you use the, I'm sorry? Is there a problem? Okay. What if you use sort of a TEDx model or something so that this can be a bit more distributed also, and you can get people in India, in Southeast Asia, in Russia, and so on, to come together and sort of give a more diverse point of view on this? Because I'm really concerned that, again, it's an American-centric or Northern European-centric view of how the world works.
Yeah, and I think that it's not productive to complain about that. It is productive to solve that.
Okay, I'm going to just want to add one thing, speaking for myself. I'm totally in agreement with the idea that there's an international conversation, and various people have made the point that it could be a much more diverse conversation. We don't own this conversation. This is owned by everybody who wants to have it. And there will be others, I'm sure. I know Berkman is doing something in Boston. I know there will be many, many, many more. But I do want to say one thing about why we did this and why there is a U.S.-centric piece to this. The spark for this event was not just WikiLeaks posting this information with the cooperation of all these news organizations. It was what we thought, Andrew and I, a heavy-handed and intimidating response by various government actors in the United States to kind of to squelch discussion and to scare people into thinking that something horrible had happened and we all had to just run and stand in line behind whatever they said had to be done. I think it has to be debated. And I also think because that squelching, that impulse to suppress is especially coming right now from the United States after all this wonderful rhetoric about internet freedom, which I certainly support, that we needed to do something here that is U.S.-centric, that makes space for discussion, that allows dissenters and disagreement, including the disagreement we're hearing here from people who think that maybe we're overreacting the other way. We got to make space for that conversation, and I don't like it. That's why I said I'm not 100% sure if I am pro-WikiLeaks, but I know I am anti-WikiLeaks.
Yes, and another relevant point to that, and I don't know, Emily, if you've discussed that at Columbia, was when that word went out to Columbia students that if they post WikiLeaks information on their Facebooks or tweet about them, it might impact whether they get jobs. And we covered it a lot on HuffPost, and we tried to get a response from the State Department, and we got a response that it's not true. And then when we followed up and we said, well, then how come Columbia said that it was a State Department directive? We were told that, well, an official from the State Department may have called, but it was not authorized. So they were hiding behind that. So that is in itself incredibly troubling.
Yes, there was a lot of discussion about that, and the dean of the international program actually said very, very strongly that students absolutely should be discussing it. A number of the faculty actually blogged on it, and I'm pleased to say that the students' initial response to receiving the email, which actually came from the careers department, who passed on the unofficial friendly words about their job prospects, the initial response of most students was immediately to post the email onto their Facebook pages, which shows that disobedience is alive and well.
Facebook force for good. Okay, David.
I'm sorry, I want to keep coming back to the question I raised. Are there any programmers in the room? Raise your hand. See, now we haven't had a technical discussion here. And this is a problem. I mean, it's great that there are so many here. And I've been so frustrated by the hackathons have been so commercial. Every API that they talk about at the hackathons are how to build more value for more of the corporate, Facebook and Bitly and so forth. When there are all these open formats and protocols out there that are perfectly good for building the kinds of communities that we need, and they're not getting any attention. I would really like to see a technical side to this, a development side to this, so that something that comes out of this is software that is usable outside the corporate context. Because I'm serious, this is what we need to have. The internet started that way, and it's drifted, and we all think we're really safe, but we're not safe as long as corporations can shut us down at will anytime they want.
One of the beauties of today, I think, is we find the mixing of many tribes who are concerned. To quote you again,
but I want a technical conversation, Jeff. That's what I'm saying.
I'm going to agree with you.
The tribe, my tribe, hasn't had the mic for very long here.
I'm going to agree with you.
That's what I'm saying.
What I'm saying is that those who should be here are here, and they came, and the tribes came together. But now I think I agree with you. There are needs for various tribes to come together on their own and figure out their roles. So the tribe of the programmers, the journalists, lawyers, government, and so on.
I have another one, too. To Rebecca's point, why after the holidays? These are American holidays, or Western holidays we're talking about here. I mean, after the holidays is right there. You're saying that this is, this thing doesn't stop during the holidays. I know you're all smiling.
Dave Weiner doesn't know very much about putting conferences on.
I know. I mean,
he actually does. Yeah.
Well, okay, Dave. So let's give us the venue, and we'll do it on Christmas Eve at 9.
I'm not saying, I'm Jewish. Okay, so like we're at Chinese restaurants on Christmas Eve. We could just as easily be doing this.
Well, you know what? I'm happy to do this event for the Jews.
I was just saying, I think it may be a little bit too early for us to be that revolutionary. It may take a bit more of a shock, but someday you might be asked to give up your holiday. It might actually happen. Maybe this isn't that event.
Actually, Jeff, that's a very good segue into my question, which is, this is not the first time we've been at this type of crisis point in terms of free speech and the internet. So the question that I have is, how do we sustain this after WikiLeaks moves off the headlines in terms of continuing that discussion?
I actually don't think that's going to be a huge challenge. I think that this is past that point, but we'll see. Because we'll make it happen ourselves. If the people who are here should be here, I said it for the fourth time, then you got to be here. You got to make it happen.
Hi, my name is Joe Plotkin. Along the lines of continuing the discussion, first of all, on the technical side, I'd love to have a discussion with you about structural separation, common carriage, net neutrality, but I think we put half the room to sleep. So it's good that we maybe have a smaller discussion.
That is the discussion I want to have, but that's all right.
You want to do it about code instead of about infrastructure?
You can have it with your tribe.
My tribe is infrastructure, so.
Oh,
okay.
My tribe too.
Okay, anyway. But I think the larger discussion that if you were going to continue it, Mika, maybe have one day where you do the New York and do it in Washington, but also globally, because I think the large part, and a number of the speakers have touched on it, especially Doug Rushkoff, about the change really is that the nation state really has lost power and the multinational corporations have gained power, and we're in this new universe. And so we don't see now in this case, the government leaned on some corporations to make them act to squash this. But I'm sure they can also find, WikiLeaks can find other hosts elsewhere around the world. So I just think there needs to be a broader understanding amongst the public, a broader public, that this is inevitable, that we have to find global governance and global rights, and we have to start thinking globally. It's not just about the U.S.
I'm sorry, I keep doing this, but net neutrality is out the window, by the way. We're totally outside of net neutrality space. When they shut people down because they don't like their content, that's violating net neutrality, right? So there is no such thing as net neutrality. Forget it. It's over.
We're down to 10 minutes, so...
Just a quick popcorn idea. What if we create like a Model UN type program where we actually pull in the WikiLeaks cables and have it as a module for schools to keep it alive and keep the conversation going? We're actually having a hackathon on education and government in first week of February, and I would love to start talking about more of these education government hacks.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, Jeff, let me just add to one of the points made earlier, and to respond to what Mika said. I don't think we should stay outside the fortress for that long. I think we should get them back here and continue to put our footprint inside the fortress. I mean, I am a U.S. citizen. It is my government. I have to take responsibility for what that government does. I thought the reaction of the Obama administration and the State Department was terrible. But I don't think we should necessarily continue to stay outside. I think they should be at this table. I think PDF has actually done terrific work in getting inside that fortress and trying to change it. And I'd like to see that continue.
Over here.
Thanks very much. My name's David Millar. I'm a private consultant. I have two comments and two thoughts that I want to acknowledge in advance are contradictory. That's the way it is. I'm a libertarian and I'm also a public servant. So those things, are in a certain amount of contact. I know, right? The first statement. I know it's hard. The first statement I want to make is that both of these have to do with framing. The first statement I want to make is governments often assert the right to secrecy, and in fact they own no such right. The privilege of secrecy is something we extend to our government as a privilege, and we as the people have the right to rescind that privilege when it's abused. So from that perspective, I think this is a hugely important occurrence. That said, I think Julian Assange has pulled sort of a fast one on us by calling this Wikileaks. And the framing aspect of this is hugely important. What he just did was not a leak. The release of the helicopter footage, that was a leak. That was a targeted release of information. What he did was a dump, a wiki dump. I mean, it's not as sexy as WikiLeaks, but the point is, yes, people have the right to leak information when they judge that the U.S. The public interest is not being served by that secrecy. In other words, that the need for the people to know this information supersedes the secrecy of it. And for me, I hold a security clearance. The threshold for ever violating that agreement, that commitment I made, is extremely high, and it would be only for something very critical importance. Just dumping information does not meet that threshold in my opinion.
Point being made for those who can't hear that they've not dumped everything out yet. I only half joke that FOIA presumes the wrong default, right? Abolish FOIA and the government should instead ask us for permission to keep something from us, is where this goes. Yes.
Hi, Dave. I like to think of myself as part of your tribe. All right. I would also like to respectfully assert that we have come to an age where we can't afford tribalism. And that... Yeah. But,
we do have communities. No?
Yes, we do have communities.
Those communities can accomplish things together, so fine.
Yep.
Wrong word, but I still think we can come together.
You get to slap them too if you want.
Right, and what I want to say is I actually don't think we can solve this problem with technology. I think we can make tools that help it. But at root, this is a problem in media education and Jeffersonian citizenship. And if we can't engage citizen understanding of media, we'll shortly have no effective democracies anywhere in the world.
Thank you, Jeff. My name is Philip Turner. I'm a book industry professional. And I just want to observe that last year there were about 550,000 books published in the United States in English language, including print on demand. And here now we're being told that there are cables more than 250,000. I'm thinking about citizens who are interested, who feel overwhelmed. And then we have professional journalism organizations on the other hand doing the redaction, doing the summaries, and no role, because of the structure of the way this has been dumped, for citizen journalism. And maybe that would scare people because of the security issues. But we are still leaving it very much to the sort of lords on high from the institutions.
Rich Robbins, building on that point, and I don't really have my view worked out, but people have talked about how it was a wiki dump or how there were 250,000 cables. To my knowledge, I think it was just over 1,000 that have been released so far. Right. And one thing people have touched upon but haven't really delved into enough in this conference is there is a filter process happening, but one of the new questions in this new world is how should that filter process work? And I think that's an important question that hasn't really been addressed enough. I do think, though, that a lot of the calls for Julian Assange's head are based on the fact that it's 250,000 documents that were dumped without any filter whatsoever, and that's not entirely accurate.
So during the course of the day, it's been clear that people have noted that the mainstream media is kind of broken in certain ways, especially in terms of the watchdog function. But I think what's interesting is that no one's raised how the media, the mainstream media, such as CNN and Fox, works along the lines of entertainment, which is what Neil Postman, for example, was very critical of, almost 20 years ago. And I think one of the reasons why Wikileaks has stuck so dramatically is because of the drama at sort of every step of the way. The drama of Julian's arrest, the drama of the cable leaks, and the drama of Anonymous. And so this is a kind of just big question which can't really be answered, but I think it's good to put on the table. As we reimagine new forms of journalism, do we try to tap into this kind of news as entertainment in new ethical ways, or do we try to sort of distance ourselves from it?
I was listening to the rather inspirational John Harris from Politico yesterday, who said something which is absolutely true, which is that both politics and media reward extremes, and that's in terms of audience and in terms of revenues often as well. And I think that it's a very good point about how you remake it. You have to connect an audience, and hence, that is why making news entertaining, but obviously it's clearly better for Fox to have 3 panelists. Again, I saw this program last week where they actually sort of men in suits and ties, all of them white, of course, saying Julian Assange should be illegally killed by the CIA, and this is sort of obviously protected by the First Amendment. Well done, but there isn't an easy answer to that, because you need to connect people to narrative which engages them. And I think the drama of this in some ways has actually served the story well. I think we're all here because of the drama of it. So I'm not going to undermine that as a sort of a gripping tale, but the work to be done on the infrastructure behind it is technical and complex, and lengthy and probably quite boring to most people. But that's why, that's actually where media organisations need to really concentrate now, is on the technical issues and aspects that this has thrown up, and how to make those serve a particular type of platform for free press in the 21st century. And that's something you probably won't see reported outside the technical press, and hopefully Dave's blog.
Yeah, I think the question in part, Emily, is how do journalists add value to this process?
Well,
they still do.
Yeah, I mean, they do, because I think that it has to be reported well, and it has to be contextualised, and it has to be explained to different audiences in different contexts, increasingly in different formats. And that's a job which actually the press that has done it well, I think, has done it really, really well. But there's just rather a lot of the press that hasn't done it particularly well.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Deborah DeVegin. I'm currently writing a book on corporate governance and philanthropy and not-for-profit organizations. And I'm a bit concerned, or at least I want to pose the challenge, that there seems to be this implicit premise or assumption that a not-for-profit organization is going to be more accurate, truer, more transparent, more accountable than a for-profit related entity. And I don't at all agree that that's the case, largely because not-for-profit organizations also are induced and have incentives by a whole host of, whether they're donors, whether their own political philosophies, the internal bureaucracies, and so on and so forth. So I think all of these organizations, all of these entities, because we are human beings, we all need to be transparent and accountable in and of ourselves. And that, if that's the new direction of journalism, regardless of the legal structure, regardless of whether it's technology-based or purely manually created, we all need to be accountable to ourselves, and also, kind of the local society and our global society. So.
Amen. And this is where Andrew and I will argue in books in the future that moving to transparency on transparency, transparency as a default doesn't solve all problems in life, but it sure gets a long way. I think that's what today's been about. I want to thank these guys again first before you all.
Thank you. So a couple of final points for everyone. So we put up a link on our site so people can take a survey and also tell us where they would like another one of these events held. We also would like to announce our final keynote just came in. We got confirmations from the following people for our conference you should try to attend. We've got Eric Holder, Jeff Bezos, Hillary Clinton, and Julian Assange. So if you would like to attend that conference, you should go to bit.ly.
How much is
Today only, $300. bit.ly/PDF 2011. Thank you for being so patient with us. Sorry that we couldn't get to everybody. Please thank our panelists for making the time and changing their schedules. We also would like to quickly thank the staff here and our staff for helping us put this together very quickly. We promised the venue that we would be out of this soft space. Oh yeah, we have to also thank Livestream, who streamed this. I think we are at 3,000 people. We have to be out of this space right away, but for those of you who want to still continue chatting, we can hang out in the bar for a little while. And please stay in touch with us, personaldemocracyforum.com. Thank you very much.
Jeff Donahue.